Welcome to Between Shelves.
where we make connections between literature, theology, philosophy, psychology, and culture.
Join us as we explore the interconnectedness of race, spirituality, psychology, and metamodernism.
Each episode invites you into a thought-provoking journey, unpacking how these elements shape our understanding of the world and ourselves.
My name is Aaron Waldron. We're a religiously traumatized theopoet and a shaman in journey. Our work focuses on creating community and between spaces for religiously traumatized millennials, navigating life beyond colonized religion.
And my name is Rafael Reyes. My work is on the importance of imagination and theopoetics in philosophy and religious pluralism.
We invite you to Between Shelves
To learn,
listen,
and become.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Between Shelves. It's great to have you here. Aaron, it's always good to see you, and always welcome on this podcast that we're co-hosting. We've been having this wonderful conversation on metamodernism and how it's shaping our world as we speak. But we haven't heard a lot about Black metamodernism or modernism as it engages other cultures, right? And that's been our question and our pursuit for some time. But we've been hearing it maybe from a European lens or just from a general lens, and not really hearing it from the lens, maybe from a Black perspective or Latino perspective. And so I think today that's what we're kind of doing. We're kind of segueing or moving into this other perspective called Black metamodernism and some persons who have shaped this. Do you have any thoughts on that before we kind of like jump into that?
Yeah. It made me think of how, for myself, we stumbled upon it in our process or journey of learning and even self-discovery. As we started to explore post-colonial frameworks of thinking, deconstructing colonial thinking, engaging or starting decolonization, we stumbled upon metamodernism as this concept of almost this African Sankofa, like we can't go forward without retrieving important things from the past that we have left behind. So this concept is how we initially understood metamodernism. It was like, wow, that's really dope. But what happens now when we apply it to like post-colonial issues? The deconstructing of chattel slavery, race, identity and society within this Western culture. And then above all, how do we reconstruct that metamodern piece, How do we even start to imagine ourselves and our futures beyond the things that we have started deconstructing in a post-colonial lens here in America? So this topic of Black metamodernism is really interesting to me because initially at face value, we're like, oh, is this only for Black people? And then as we explored it more and looked into who was talking about this and get form, and structure, we noticed that no, Black is a symbol, an artistic symbol to emulate everyone that's not part of the colonial imagination. Because it seems like the world is dominated by the colonial imagination, right? And we're trying to find ourselves in the midst of all that, But yeah, that's what we thought of.
When you were talking, you brought an interesting point that I want to just raise up again. When we've been considering metamodernism in general, there seems to be we realize that there is an issue of race and we have to deal with it. But when we looked at Black metamodernism, it's seeing metamodernism from within to say, yeah, we are the ones receiving those issues. We're the ones in the midst of those issues. And how do we see ourselves and how do we break out of it, right? And you talk about post-colonialism, you mentioned that. And Post-colonialism is that framework of thinking is of how do we find ourselves beyond colonial thinking. And so it seems to me like this black meta-modernism is how do we understand meta-modernism outside of a colonial framework of thinking, which is what I think black meta-modernism does. And I think you also bring another point, this idea of black. It brings to me James Cone, someone that we've read and known, right, on Black liberation theology, and in particular, what he says there is black is not meaning a skin color, but but this perspective, right? What does it mean to be black? And then he lays it out. This is what it means. So if you're on this side, you are black. And so I see this happening in in the same framework. It's an other, right? It's an other metamodernism. It's looking at using a different historical lens to say, what does metamodernism look like? What does life look like beyond modernity, which is where we have civil war, civil rights era, right? The begin and what does it look like even after postmodernism? Because although postmodernism may have been helpful in establishing an identity, it led to something very interesting called hypermodernity. And this hypermodernity is that super individualism, which is actually opposite from black thinking, right? From a form of black liberation, or even a form from even Latinx thinking. I want to start incorporating that because I think you and I both, from our own Latinx backgrounds, Cuban, Puerto Rican, African, Caribbean heritages. Um, this move to hypermodernity is problematic because we're not individualistic. We are heavily community oriented. And our belonging is within community. We can't dance without the congas and the bongos, right? Which automatically means, hey, we have a relationship. I dance with, right? And that as an example of this community piece and the struggles that we face. So when we hear this Black metamodernism, it's looking at a different history, a different historical lens, and then shapes metamodernism or what we're seeing. And so with that, we were talking about this earlier before the podcast. Metamodernism is not a thing that's in place, but a feeling. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what you meant by that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That was another intriguing piece for me about the framework of metamodernism, that the underlying foundation was a feeling. It came out of an artistic expression, right? Even from a theological perspective, this would then be a more imaginative relationship versus a logical relationship. We could have logos versus Sophia, masculine versus feminine. And so you see that with metamodernism being something that's built upon a feeling, it's very much human like, right? It's something that humans can get closer to because we are filled with and run by feelings, emotions. We're very emotional beings. So our frameworks should start to include that emotional intelligence, right? In this kind of way where we start to say, wait, we used to be afraid of this. We used to think that this was wrong or not valid. But now as we circle back, we're beginning to learn that we can learn something new, you know?
So that's awesome. I want to say that that echoes something that we find when we have a discussion on postmodernity and postmodernism. That when this shift from modernity to postmodernity was happening, it starts off as a feeling because in reality, it's sort of like, we know we can't do this anymore. And so what we're seeing are reactions to the outcome of modernity in full force. And what we now do is we're like surfing that wave and feeling out, what does it look like? Where do we need to go? And kind of surfing that out. And I'm seeing the same thing here in metamodernity. Metamodernity is what, at least maybe 20 years old? something like that. And yet we're still feeling it out. It's still shaping and formulating because if we look at even our present day, it's shaping because there's a backlash, there's a push because they don't want it to happen. But nevertheless, this, yeah, it's a feeling that's forming and it's solidifying, it's concretizing. We're seeing it in multiple ways. I kind of wanted to go back to this other history piece. And when we speak with Jermaine Marvel, and he's one of the ones that he's going to be joining us in our next podcast concerning Black Meta-Modernism. He's been sort of the forerunner in writings and really lifting it up. But he brings this really interesting concept of the two cradles, and that there's a northern cradle and a southern cradle, which has a different way of understanding history and frameworks of thinking. And I think what Jermaine Marvel does, he goes in the northern cradle, which is what we see in the West, is where we see these notions of scarcity, um, and logic, right? Efficiency, which leads to what he considers what this move towards AI, which is that ultimate efficiency. These decisions that are made to reduce, so we get best outcomes. And so Black Meta-Modernism actually doesn't come out from that, but chooses the Southern cradle, which is the more matrilineal places, relationship oriented, um, and more communal in that sense, and leads off from abundance. And I find that fascinating because then meta-modernism that is abundant, right? A cultural framework of thinking that deals with abundance, that allows for cultural expression, is sort of like a burden off. Once again, I think that is what we're facing today, in the sense that where they're trying to remove other cultural ways of thinking, right? To this one way of cultural thinking. This is the best. This is the only way to think. And it's great and it's good. And this matrilineal framework, what they call the Southern cradle, that Jermaine Marvel brings out, is fascinating because it allows for expression, because the culture of who we are contains all of that. And it really gives strength to the black meta-modern framework of thinking of the both and. We hear that in meta-modernism, but this really finds its resonance. We really begin to see it when we understand that Southern cradle framework of thinking. And I just found that to be beautiful.
Definitely, definitely. Just to piggyback off that, it's interesting how the Southern cradle as a symbol, close to or right at the equator, and, really in parallel to this abundance, this idea that we have so much, we can prosper, we can share, we don't have to fight over, we don't have to create systems like capitalism and democracy and whatnot, because we don't have to control as much, because everyone can have and take and we can still have leftover. And then you have this psychology that develops in the South, in the warmth, in more of the sunlight, more vitamin D, more melanin. We can keep breaking this down, but you see how the Southern cradle appears so rich, so abundant, but the Northern one, it then makes the story make a little bit more sense. Why would you be so angry and hurt that you would devise systems of thinking that are rooted in control, built on enslavement, built on lies, manipulation, right? And then you glorify politics. So, it's really interesting that these people that are experiencing and were traumatized deeply by scarcity, it fascinates me how they have devised and used their imagination to create these oppressive yet creative ways to oppress people. You know what I mean? It's not like right smack in front of our face, but you got to look a little deep to see in between the lines to figure it out. But it's there. And they devised these things years ago. These people are not dumb. We're not dealing with ignorance like that. I think we're dealing with that trauma piece, you know? And I find it fascinating that as color people, it's hard for us to get to that level, because we are still experiencing so much trauma that we're not there to say, I see your hurt more than me. Because right now, most of us can only see, I'm the most hurt. And that's amongst each other, So it is interesting that the cradle theory or mythology helps us see history a little different. It's not as biased. It says, oh, there was two. There was a choice. So, then that makes everything else say, if it was a choice, then everything we have right now is by choice. And that makes everything hella complicated. It's no more Republican, Democrat. It ain't that easy no more. It's people have formed families or groups and then made specific choices that affected hundreds of thousands of other people by design, like a domino effect. They've tried to calculate these things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of what we do are choices. I think almost everything is choice, whether forced or critically thought upon. The question, and then I go back to these two words: is where the choice is based on scarcity or where the choice is based on abundance? Just to note, the author that speaks about the cradles was Chik Anta Diop. Chike Anta Diop, and talks about these two geographical regions. I mean, they consider the northern patriarchal and the southern cradle matriarchal, which lends itself to different societal structures, different values, and different reasonings. And what's interesting is that even on the southern cradle, on questions of, let's say, AI and development, they say the advancements of quantum computing and AI development leads to a more flexible AI, as opposed to looking for an AI that's super fast, that does well on these one things. Then we can beat others. And it's a move away from competitiveness to cooperation. It's fascinating, these ways of thinking, because then that's a meta-modern way of thinking. There is a big push against meta-modern ways of thinking, because that would mean that we have to admit or affirm the other as equal, right? And that is the issue. Giles Deleuze, in his own post-structuralist work out of postmodernity, was one of affirmation of difference. And that's the push. We're pushing against this affirmation of difference, and that there can be only one way, because then there is a reckoning that our religion isn't unique and better, that our technologies aren't unique or better, that our monetary systems, our power, and even our democracy is not better. And it's not democracy that we're upholding. It's something else. It's maybe the upholding of empire as better. And so then thinking from a meta-modern perspective is a breath of fresh air. It is sort of like a salvific experience, just the way postmodernity was salvific. It saved us because we were drowning in modernity. Postmodernity saves, but then we're drowning in postmodernity, and now we're in meta-modernism because of certain outcomes. So certain outcomes. Hypermodernity is not healthy. Nihilism is not healthy, right? All means nothing, or everything turns out to be for nothing. There is no meaning. And so metamodernity tries to reincorporate value, looking at our histories and looking at the values that have been passed down to us from it. So there's some deep value in that. Another piece, and I think this is the interesting part of Black Meta-Modernism with that both and thinking. And I want to borrow what Jermaine Marvel used. He calls it diunital way of thinking of the both and. But he uses this different term. I think it comes from another scholar by the name of Vernon Dixon, who was an artist. I think he was one of the first to coin Black Meta-Modernism. I'm not too sure about that one. But this diunital thinking was termed that way because for blacks, for people of color, I want to expand it out. We get some form of cognitive difference because we have to sort of decide between conflicting beliefs. We can see that when we're seeing a Hispanic that has to choose between their culture and American culture to survive, or blacks having to choose between their culture and another culture to survive, or Asians having to choose between cultures, having to code switch. There's that form of cognitive difference, of a conflict of values and beliefs and ways of thinking in order to survive and to make it. And he uses these two terms, diunital and triunital, because he goes, these are the only ways that we can somewhat survive and break out of that cognitive difference. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. And if not, then it's okay.
Oh yeah, it's definitely. um, Diurnal thinking for me is more like a dialogue, you know, going back to Paulo Freire and how we need more than just one to engage, you know. So for me, when we were learning and embodying theopoetics, this frame of thinking was in the background. It had to be, because if not, then we wouldn't be open to consider our own shadows, our own ignorance, our own privileges, so like all these things have to be brought forward so that we can have more of a realistic ground in which we can both be on and build on, you know. I think it's very important that authenticity and even, being deliberate about things, like taking words and making it into action. I think that's very courageous, but it does require more than one. It's like a ping pong back and forth, and once you build up that good amount of rhythm or energy, you can do incredible things. But when you're bouncing it against something that's not bouncing it back, you're bouncing a dead wall. It's just like, what am I doing? I'm wasting my energy here.
True. And those examples can go a lot of ways. I think where and you're right on. I think you're spot on that diunital thinking. It's just an honoring of what emerges from the two frameworks. What's interesting for me with that is how that conflict with post-colonial or decolonial frameworks of thinking, which says I have to completely remove colonial frameworks because that creates limitations on who I am and what I do. And that means my framework of thinking is not a 50-50, right? It's not emerging as something equal that comes out, but is always won over by that which is the first, which is the thesis, as you will. For Hegel, right? Because this is an idea that Hegel comes out and we're using it. I always felt that dialectics was a bit unfair because it still works on the framework of which one is more important. The first one is always going to be more important. First one is bigger. I have to prove my thesis, but I have this antithesis. So let me get the good stuff out of it, and then I leave the rest behind. That's for me is problematic. And I would hope that the diunital framework of thinking and the meta-modern framework of thinking, and what I would also say is the process framework of thinking, because I'm a process thinker, is that it's never only going to take the best. But in the engagement with the two, I have to come to grips with the reality that I kind of have to throw away both of them and see what happens and emerges with when both of them come together equal. That's a different way of thinking. That's a very different way of thinking. That comes out of in Alfred North Whitehead's book, Adventure of Ideas, when he talks about peace. And he says peace is a gift. But when he describes it, he's saying, for me, in order to be able to engage with peace, I have to let go of my idea of peace and allow it to become a vector, right? And vector in mathematics, it's a point of convergence. That point of convergence shifts ways of thinking. So I affect the change, but knowing that my answer isn't the right one. Once again, a mind-blowing different way of thinking that challenges the notion of thesis as synthesis, saying that the first one and the second one, I'm only going to grab the best of the second one, so I get this synthesis. It can't be that way. And so my hopes is that in Black meta-modern thinking, we don't do that. We don't do what we see in dialectical thinking, but that we are truly honoring these cultural brothers and sisters who can help me shape a better idea, knowing that my idea isn't it, that my view isn't it, but it should somewhat get someone to think and then create a different view that looks at both. That's not easy. That's not efficient. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say on that. That's risky. I like that. That's risky. I mean, it's no more the United States idea, but it's a globalized idea. It's Russia and the US working together. Russia, US, China, Korea, Peru, Venezuela, Argentina, and then just naming them as equals as part of it. That's a risk. That is that matrix style of thinking. Everything is there. Everything is there, right? It doesn't get confounded into one. It's all there, and you have to see it as all. So yeah, this I think that's Black Meta-Modernism pushes that further, pushes that a lot further, and that's what's fascinating that I'm seeing in my readings of Black Meta-Modernism.
In this thought-provoking episode of Between Shelves, we dive into the transformative concept of Black meta-modernism. This emerging framework reimagines meta-modern thought through the rich, complex lens of Black and other cultural experiences, histories, and narratives. From art to philosophy, culture, and spirituality, we're unpacking how Black meta-modernism disrupts outdated frameworks around race, belonging, mess, and self-expression, opening up new pathways for reimagining the future. Whether you're a seeker, a scholar, or just curious about the evolution of identity in our ever-changing world, this dialogue has something for you. Catch the latest dialogue Between Shelves, streaming now on all your favorite podcast platforms. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Let's explore the in-between together. And now, let's return to our dialogue with Aaron and Raphael as we continue exploring how Black meta-modernism reshapes our understanding of identity, creativity, and the ever-evolving journey of becoming in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's interesting too. We wrote that small little book called A Strange Fruit, Theopoetics of Slavery in America. This was really before we started exploring Black metamodernism. But we noticed that when we were learning more about Black metamodernism, we're like, oh, this book, a particular chapter we wrote called The Colonizer in Me. And it just adds to what we were just talking about, and this idea that I can't get rid of it completely, and in the chapter we were describing in a theopoetic way how when we look for it to look different than us, we see that it's a reflection of us. It's us. Like these ideas have transcended into our identity, and it's our ego, or it could be another aspect of us that's trying to preserve something that it feels is safer or for our betterment, or protection, these very primitive yet powerful notions that are happening in our psyche. And it's crazy how we're looking to look at, like, oh, white people, they're the problem, for example. And it's like, no, actually, it's us. We're doing this. We're perpetuating it. We're keeping this thing alive up here, and when we start to realize that and you start wrestling with your frame of thinking, it's very sacred, but it's also very vulnerable, I would say. It's not something you take lightly.
That's mind blowing what you said, because, when we're there seems to be a competitiveness when we're looking at frameworks. Let's say, for instance, when we think about futurism, and then we talk about, let's say, Latinx futurism or Black futurism, which then is sort of like a swipe at the other, right? And saying we made a better one. And so it maintains or continues a competitiveness, right? And also this need for survival, which becomes combative. And so what I like, and once again, I want to go back to meta-modernism, Black meta-modernism, and I'll also here include something we really haven't talked about, Latinx forms of meta-modernism, is that we can use the same terms and it leads to the same failures. And so what we need to do is begin using different terminology that shifts the focus and shifts the argument. And I think that becomes mind blowing, because then it's not a combative response, but here's my stuff, here's your stuff, let's bring it together. And I think that's a fabulous thing that you bring up, and came out of what you just said. There's a need to not use these same terminologies, because then it's I'm pissing on you, so to speak.
Yeah, or it could come off as I'm ignoring what you have expressed, and even in my early studies in the MDiv in seminary, when we were learning about the early civil rights movement, and this historical piece that overlaid the race and the theology, learning about Black theology, liberation theology, and it was just like, it's so interesting how they're saying the same things, but somehow they don't collaborate. They don't bridge. Why? And so because of that, even in the academic spaces, this division remains perpetuated, where you have professionals that are like, well, I'm Latinx, well, I'm Black, well, I'm Asian, well, I'm queer, and I'm not saying we should all be one. That's not the answer. But what we are trying to really focus on is, it's awesome that my neighbor is expressing themselves, and we should listen. And then when we express ourselves, we talk in a manner that doesn't put down the other perspective, but says, this exists as well, you know?
Yeah, and a great example of that is, Kwak is probably one of the major influences in post-colonial theologies. And she did this wonderful critique of Max Mueller, who did sort of like a comparative religions and history of religions piece. And her critique of it, was saying this is very one-voiced, right? And this comes out of the Western perspective. And so you never really know fully the voices of others because you never invited them. And that's what that colonial mindset does. Then, if we use the same voices that they use, the same terms, we still aren't speaking the same language, because I can't articulate who I am to you in that language.
Or they dictate the interpretation.
Or yeah, because well, that's exactly the reason why. Because once I do it, I've already fallen prey to their interpretation. And so once again, Gayatri Spivak and Can the Subaltern Speak, classical post-colonial text that talks about that, hey, we don't even have our own podiums to speak. Because if we have our own podiums, they won't understand. And then the question is, do they need to understand, or do they need to begin to sort of listen and learn from us? But anyway, I think the Black Meta-Modernism piece is a letting go of both. It's an acceptance of both. It's a letting go of both to see what arises out of it. And I think this is what I'm finding intriguing in the work of Black Meta-Modernism, that I would almost argue pushes a little bit more than what we're seeing in metamodernism in general. I think that's been thought out a bit more and allows for at least the invitation for others to chime in.
Yeah, we would definitely hear what you're saying. Like, there's definitely more of a Black meta-modernity happening over a meta-modernity. Yeah, like Black modernity has context, culture, language, specificity, historical events, that correlate. But metamodernism as a thinking frame is just a big umbrella. In order to do the action, we should find ourselves in these emergings like Black metamodernism, post-colonial metamodernism, Latinx metamodernism. Like it starts to emerge and populate as an action, a verb. That's when we can add the modernity piece to it, you know? But I always find that interesting how metamodernism is the umbrella. And as we think in our own contexts and our own life experiences, we start to develop the verb, the action. And what does that look like? You know?
Yeah. Just as a side note, as we're closing up, it's going to be interesting because from what I'm hearing, what you're saying, when Latinx begins to formulate their own, if they haven't formulated it already, it's not going to say metamodernism. It's going to it's going to say something different. I would almost argue that maybe Black metamodernism won't stay as Black metamodernism, but what Jermaine Marvel is kind of alluding to, like Black infinitism, which he's hopefully is going to speak a bit about next time in the podcast. It's something different. It's something different.
On a very parallel side note, the film Heretic came out 2024. Did you see it yet? Oh god. But yeah, it is interesting to bring up later on about the topic of religion being open or religions being open and the idea of bridges and collaborating amongst faiths. It's just interesting how we try to imagine all these monotheistic faiths working together. But I don't know, maybe it's funny to me and not to others, but it's just interesting how, the belief in one God for each section, and we're all asking them to work under the earth as a collaborative nature, and they're all still like, well, my God or my interpretation of God, and it's like, how do you settle that tone to where they can start talking amongst their differences and see the overlapping, the intersectionalities?
Yeah. This is why I don't think apologetics works. The study of apologetics or the field of apologetics still falls under a patriarchal, combative framework of thinking. So, they'll say this person has it wrong, so their logic and their theology is wrong. That's what apologetic tends to boil down to. We see it in atheism theological debates, right? You're wrong because of this, you're wrong because of that. That's why I don't. This hard logic just doesn't win the day. It creates animosity, it creates tension, it creates dissension, it creates war, in my opinion. Not to throw myself in there, but I think a lot of the reason why I work in imagination, the author John Salas wrote something in his book, The Force of Imagination, where he says imagination asks us to take everything. Let's say if we just use religion, all the religions, and we put them together in an image, and it's in its most tightest. I mean, they're like probably face to face, neck to neck. They're like this. And then the idea is to hover over it to see what's happening. But he goes, in just an instant, that image breaks. But what's left for us is a glimpse and a possibility of what can happen. That for me is a method that I see Catherine Keller doing and Roland Farber saying, what happens when we join these aspects of God together? Not that they're wrong, because it's this is how they see it. Let's piece it together. Let's see what the elephant looks like. That is a better response because we're not here to say everyone this person's wrong or that person's wrong. It's like what does the damn elephant look like? What are the values that we uphold? So and it's not a one-to-one. It's gonna look janky,
Yeah.
but it's there. It's something to work with.
Again, it goes back to that northern southern cradle. They're coming from a place of scarcity that they have to prove. You notice that like there's like an overarching pattern among people that are insecure. They feel like they have to prove something, like, and the fact that you have to prove it, maybe something's not there. You're trying to compensate, and everyone trying to prove something, they're looking for outward affirmation. Like when you start to really realize, you know what, I'm smart enough. I no longer have to prove to people that I'm smart. I no longer have to impress them with words or what I'm talking about. Like I'm just myself. So you see that even in the oscillation between the southern cradle and the northern cradle. You know, you have a very heavily traumatized experience versus that abundance, loving experience. And it's crazy how we could see this in those little dialogues or those little analytical sections of looking at people and history. And it's like, dang, these patterns are shape shifting, but they're similar, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that's what we have from Black Meta-Modernism, because what's coming up next is we're going to have Jermaine Marvel joining us
Yeah.
in our next podcast to talk a little bit about his the development of Black Modernism from his own from two pieces, right? His own initial discussions with meta-modern scholars and groups, and then also doing his own historical research on his own scholarship.
Yeah. Which is very interesting and worth the read or look into.
Yeah, and he's a musician.
Yeah. Artist, musician,
He's a facilitator,
facilitator, spiritualist.
spiritualist. Yeah. So it's going to be great conversation, and we're going to have a good time. Well, then, thank you everybody for joining us and being a part of this conversation. We hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time on our podcast.